All right, we'd like to call this meeting of the West Dallas West Milwaukee School District to order, please. Would you please rise for the pledge? Mr. Sikich, would you be able to lead us, please?
I would be proud to.
Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. All right, could we do roll, please, Suzette?
Yes. Mr. Sikich,
Present.
Mr. Schultz,
Tom,
Mr. Schultz, mute.
Gary, are you there?
Gary has to unmute.
Sound issues. Yeah, Gary's here. He's yes, here.
Mr. Lee,
Here.
Mr. Ustruck,
Here.
Mrs. Justum,
Here.
Ms. Klug is excused, Mrs. Kaiser,
Here.
Mr. Keller,
Here.
and President Emmons.
Here. Proper notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with the open meeting laws of the state of Wisconsin. Do you have any changes or modifications to tonight's agenda, Dr. Lexman?
I have nothing this evening.
Board members? We'll then move on to item 6 on the agenda this evening, our public comments. As a reminder, if you are here for public comments, if you'd like to put your name in the chat so we can make sure that we cover everybody who wants to make a public comment. The chat is on the bottom of the Zoom meeting. If you do make a public comment, please leave your name and your address. And you have up to 3 minutes to address the board. Is anybody here for public comments this evening? Jeff?
Just one quick statement. Can you talk a little slower? I'm getting you very choppy and I'm getting like every other word.
Oh, okay. Is there something, Brandon, is there anything with our internet?
Yeah, I would kind of like to make a comment. My name is David Ingold, and I'm West Dallas. I have a child in Wilson School. I just kind of want to see what a classroom would look like after, I guess, we adding children to the schools. Maybe if you could post some photos or something, what a typical classroom would look like.
Thank you, Mr. Ingold. Could you please state your address for the public comment record?
Sure. 1527 South 85th Street in West Dallas, 53214 zip code.
Thank you very much. Are there any other public comments?
We received an email today from a constituent asking for their questions to be asked. Should we be doing that for them?
No, I addressed that email separately.
Oh, thank you very much.
Any other public comments before we move on today? Suzette did adjust the volume on her computer, so that may adjust the speed of which you're able to hear me, because she and I are right by each other. So there might be some feedback from that.
Okay.
Hopefully this is a little bit better. Okay, great, thank you. We will then move on to item 7, the superintendent's report. Dr. Lexman.
Great, good evening, everybody, and thank you. We'll start with 7.1, the legislative update. All right, so at the state level, I think everybody's aware, but Governor Evers declared a new public health emergency, issuing a mask mandate, citing a rise in COVID-19 cases in Wisconsin. Governor Tony Evers last week issued a new public health emergency, and along with a mandate that people wear a mask while indoors. Under the mandate, effective Saturday, this past Saturday, those 5 and older are required to wear a face covering when they're inside or an enclosed space other than a private residence and around those who aren't members of their household. His executive order also strongly recommends face coverings in other settings, including outdoors when it isn't possible to maintain social distancing. The mask order was issued under a new public health emergency, and it goes for 60 days. So that's actually helpful for us if we come back into schools with kids coming back to learning from our buildings within that 60-day window, because it is a very consistent expectation that the board set when we adopted our returning to school framework a couple of weeks ago. And at the federal level, Title IX regulations on May 19, 2020, the U.S. Department of Education published its new Title IX regulations covering sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and sexual assault education programs and activities. The new regulations take effect on August 14th, 2020, in time for the start of the 2020-2021 school year. Like every school district, we are reviewing various policies and procedures in connection with the implementation of the new Title IX regulations. There'll also be training and staff development related to Title IX regulations, and you'll also see us, even though we're bringing forward the Students' Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. There may be updates to it as we understand more fully and get more advice from our attorneys on Title IX. You'll also start to see more prominent information about Title IX expectations on our website, which is a new requirement, so that it's more front and center in terms of communicating these regulations to staff, to parents, to students, to the community. Darn it, and I just jumped out of the board meeting. I'm sorry about that. Now I can see if I can get myself back in here.
You're on my screen and I can hear you.
Yeah, I just jumped out of the agenda.
Oh,
It's just learning to navigate the new version of it, so I apologize for that. Okay, Suzette, where is it now? Current meeting, there. Sorry. Okay, I'm back. And then we'll jump to 7.2, district recognitions. In leadership and learning, special thanks go to Deidre Raymer, her whole team, and student services personnel for implementing a professional development program centered on our equity non-negotiables. So this took place last week. Our leaders met weekly. Previous to that, our leaders met weekly around a book study with presentations and discussions about race, equity, and education. And the program last week culminated with a visit from Dr. Chris Emden. He is an associate professor of science education at the Teachers College and director of science education at the Center for Health, Equity, and Urban Science Education at Columbia University. So Dr. Emden is a Harvard and Columbia grad. And so he is not a lightweight when it comes to his research area and his intellectual capacity. And what we love about him, he is a really straight shooter, straight talker when it comes to the issues related to equity and justice. So he's incredibly challenging, incredibly inspiring. And we just love working with him. So we got a lot of really good feedback about his engagement with us last week. We look forward to more. He said, you told Deidre, when this whole COVID-19 thing is done, I'm coming to visit that West Allis because he wants to know what we're really doing. He wants to see our work. And so the books that were part of the book study, and I'm not going to, you have the kind of synopsis of the books, but How to Be an Anti-Racist. So you want to talk about race was one of the book titles. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? That by Beverly Daniel Tatum. And this is a book that is it was first released 20 years ago. And so it was fascinating. And I was in that book, and I read this book many years ago in college. So it released 20 years later, and it has some new updates, but so much of it is still the same. And we still have some of the very same challenges to deliver on kind of equitable environments and equitable outcomes for all kids. And then a book that has become very popular in the era of Black Lives Matters and the protests that have gone on this summer, called White Fragility. It's a book that is actually very difficult to get your hands on right now, even on Amazon, because it's become so popular. So we had all of our leaders in one of these 4 book studies, and culminating with Dr. Emden. So we just really a big shout out to Leadership and Learning for the way they organized all that. And even in the midst of everything else that we're trying to figure out in this day and time in education, still our focus on equity continues, and we think that's really important for us in our work.
Marty, can I just add one quick thing to that? It was also the first time that we did a joint workshop between our leaders and our student services staff, as they're the ones who are going to be, they do a lot of the frontline works with supporting our students and our teachers, and understanding the psychological needs of kids and understanding kind of the stressors on kids in the world today. And so it was really important to include them as part of the 4-week workshop in the summer, as well as they had their own session with Dr. Emden in the afternoon. And so they were, as a team, our student services staff participated, as well as our high school department chairs and ILT leaders. And they were very appreciative of the opportunity to learn and grow with him in the afternoon and have kind of their own time to really develop their thoughts in that area as well. So
cool. Yeah, thanks, Deidre. Thanks for adding that. And then we'll go on to 7.3, updates and information items from me. So on the returning to school front, so we'll, what David shared in the public comments, I think that's a great tip, and to have some photos as we develop our returning to school guide will help people kind of visualize what classrooms will look like, especially when we're in the phase called distance learning. That's where students are coming back to school 2 days a week, because that really is the opportunity to provide good social distancing. As we return more to 4 or 5 days, that's less the case, but pictures of how classrooms are set up as we hit that phase after virtual, I think will be helpful. We continue our planning process. Our focus now in our returning to school committee and the various work teams is really developing our return to school guide. And so teams are making some really good progress. And it's a guide that we'll publish for the public, for parents. It'll be up on our website in a more web-based format rather than a big PDF document. Where we are in the process right now is Beth and I and Frone and Aaron Norris met with all of the school secretaries this morning to go over the process where they're now reaching out to families that did not select a learning option. So we worked through, and Beth developed a script, and we worked through the kind of questions they might get from parents based on what we've received so far. So our secretaries are more equipped to respond. And now we're trying to follow up to make sure every family has an option. We also know that some families may start to call their school and say, I'd like to change my option. That's okay. They don't have to right now. The communication we sent out this past Friday. So we're doing updates on our returning to school planning every single Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. And in that, our most recent one, we communicated to families, if you want to make a change, you don't have to do anything. We'll be calling all families in September. But if families reach out to their schools right now, secretaries are prepared to make a change if they wanted a different learning option. And so we're looking forward to kind of working through that process, because those final data points will help us finalize staffing. And that's an important kind of next step as we work through all of this. Our principals are doing what principals do. Administrators are trained in problem solving. And so one of the big problems to solve is staffing, and in particular, especially for elementary kids, to make sure that the teacher they start with is the teacher they stay with as we work through the phases. And I was really, really cautious about what we were trying to promise parents, thinking that we're never going to be able to do that with these multiple phases. But our principals are starting to see the options and opportunities, even with incomplete data. And some of it may even be a couple elementary schools working together to make sure that kids, have a teacher that'll be their teacher all year, even if they stay virtual, or in particular, as they start virtual and then start coming back to schools. So we appreciate our principals going into the kind of deep problem solving mode. And then another step we launched this past week is information out to all employees, that where employees may have needs where they would like to ask for a leave of absence. That could be an entire year, but we still have a job for them when they're ready to come back. It would be an option to take a short-term leave under FMLA or ADA, or a work from home option. And so that's information that's out there, and employees are contacting Jeff Thompson if they have questions and starting to submit that information. Again, it helps with our staffing. Then related to returning to school, athletics. is going to become kind of front and center this week as we get closer to the launch of the low risk sports and then later the high risk sports in September. But what we know is that WIAA again is meeting this Friday, and there may be additional information or decisions or directives that come. If you're watching what's happening in collegiate athletics, more large conferences are starting to cancel, in particular football. And there's more of those on the horizon likely. And that may have influence on what happens in high school athletics as well. On the Woodland Conference, for those listening, we have high schools in two different conferences. Central is in the Woodland Conference, Nathan Hale is in the Greater Metro Conference. And the Woodland Conference superintendents and ADs met this morning, and collectively we agreed right now to delay the start of low risk athletics to August 24th. So it delays it by 1 week. The rationale with that, and I agreed with it, is that rather than start the low risk athletics a week earlier on the 17th, but yes, on the 17th, or whatever that date is, and get those started, and then later find out, meaning after this Friday or after Friday, that some of the fall athletics, the high risk sports, volleyball, soccer, are going to be canceled. It means then there's a whole group of athletes that maybe would have tried out or shown up for the low risk athletics to still have an opportunity to participate. So we thought, let's just pause it, get started on August 24th. And so that information came out as a press release from the Woodland Conference today. But what it means for us is because we have schools in two different conferences, I also sent essentially the directive from me to Nathan Hale and to the Woodland Conference that Nathan Hale will also pause participation in low risk athletics until August 24th. I think it's really important as we move through the athletic decisions and follow the guidance that because we have two high schools and two different conferences, we keep them moving together. I think it's just a kind of internal fairness and equity across our two schools. And I did share that with the Woodland Conference as well. It creates complications for us, and that's our intent, so that I need them to understand there's ripple effects into other conferences because of how we're configured right now. I also want to note that at this point, if there are competitions going forward in any of the sports, low risk or high risk, at this point, the Woodland Conference has kind of just tentatively committed. We're really still discussing whether or not spectators would be allowed. And at this point, my sense is they're leaning towards no spectators and doing the live streaming of athletic events. One of the interesting conversations that goes back to the legislative update on Title IX is we had a pretty lengthy conversation around the equity expectations in Title IX, and to make sure that if we're live streaming some sports, we have to live stream all of the sports because the interest will be, I'm assuming here, the interest will be in live streaming football games. Well, that's a male-only sport. And under Title IX, we have to have equal access and opportunities in athletics. So the commitment among the districts was to make sure we live stream all of athletic activity, all athletic competitions, if there will be no spectators. And again, with each of these will also work to align our decisions with Nathan Hale in the Greater Metro Conference. And then finally, my update. Today we had a couple-hour meeting with C.G. Schmidt and Beyer, our architects, in our facility planning process. And Deidre and I agreed by the end of the 2 hours, our heads were spinning with how much work they've gotten done and how detailed the facility analysis has gone. But it was also refreshing that our heads are spinning in an entirely different direction for a couple hours, which was really healthy for us because right now it's all about, the return to school under, a health emergency, and to know that the facility planning process is continuing. There's some very good work that's been done. We're going to start meeting more frequently with them, meaning the administrative team and in particular directors, to start setting some parameters that'll help guide decision making as we start to consider various scenarios. And that'll also help us prepare for the workshop with the board on August 24th. So that's the next engagement in the facility planning process with the board. And I think it's important for the board to understand that there's a window of time here where things on the facility side are going to need to move pretty quickly. And that's essentially between the end of August and the end of October, early November at the latest, where there will be decisions that the board is going to need to make. And an example and it causes all kinds of anxiety, and we get that, but I just want to be clear and honest with the public, with the board, is if we're going to be consolidating schools, there's a window in which that decision needs to be made early to late fall within that window in order for us to be able to communicate and plan for that the following school year. And some of that we know is part of our facility planning process. And so more detail will come around that as we work more with our architect and construction teams and working towards the August 24th workshop. But I just thought I'd update the board and public listening, just where we are right now, and also to share that work is going forward in the midst of everything else. And I think that's encouraging for us. And that concludes the superintendent's report.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ellison. All right, we'll move on to item 8, board president's report. Taking a look at the board calendar. Tonight is August 10th, already August 10th. We have a regular Board of Education meeting today. Next Monday, August 17th, starting at 6 p.m., we do have a workshop on an update on the reopening of the school plan. On Monday, August 24th, starting at 6 p.m., we have a regular Board of Education meeting, and immediately following the Financial Stability and Efficiency Workshop, the facilities update. On Monday, September 14th, starting at 6 p.m., we have a regular Board of Education meeting, and following that, a Financial Stability and Efficiency Workshop, our public budget hearing. As a reminder, all of these meetings are available virtually, and the Zoom links are always posted on our website for each meeting to join. Do any board members have any public events or dates? Okay, we will then move on to item 9, the consent agenda. There are 3 items this evening. Item 9.1, the approval of the minutes from July 27th, 2020, regular Board of Education meeting. Item 9.2, the employment summary. And item 9.3, the supplementary contracts. Does anyone need anything separated? If not, we'll look for a motion.
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any additional comments or questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the consent agenda passes. Dr. Lexman?
Yes, thank you. As we customarily do, administrator was approved. And so I'm pleased to introduce to the board Laura and Spruill. I'm sorry, I don't yet know how to pronounce your last name. But welcome aboard. And I'm just going to say I think it's a feather in our cap that we're able to bring somebody on board as an experienced administrator from Wauwatosa. I love that. And so, Laura, it's an opportunity for you to introduce yourself to the board, share a little bit of your background, a little bit of kind of your experience with us so far. So go ahead.
Sure, thank you. It's Spruill. So you were so close, but I've heard it said that way many, many times. And thank you for making me sound like such a catch. So, I'm really thankful for the opportunity to join the district. I'm encouraged by the commitment of the district in addressing the system-wide needs around equity. And that's something that I have a fair amount of experience with in working in Wauwatosa. I am coming from an environment where I worked in county programs, and county programs is an umbrella over 5 programs that are all alternative programs. So Bellar Phillips Juvenile Detention School, Children's Hospital, Acute Behavioral Health, GED Option 2, and Wauwatosa Virtual Academy. So, this is a shift, but it's a great shift. I've already been a part of multiple discussions, and it's clear that the district is very student and family focused. And I'm looking forward to all the adventures and opportunities this year will bring.
Welcome. We're really glad to have you.
Okay.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Matt's giving you a clap in there. So. Awesome.
Good catch.
Great, thank you very much. Then move on to our action items for this evening. Item 10.1, the open enrollment seats for 2020-2021. Caitlin, do you want to take that?
Yep. So I'm going to give Aaron the floor in just a second. So he's going to walk through the request to approve additional seats for 12th graders.
Yeah, thanks for having us tonight. This is ends up being almost an annual item that we discuss every board meeting in August. So essentially the background is we're asking for the school board to approve 6 open enrollment seats for seniors tonight. So essentially what happens is we come to the school board each January with our recommendation for the number of open enrollment seats. And so we calculate the number of seniors that were on tuition waiver at that time as juniors for their senior year to have enough seats to keep students who are going into their senior year with us for their last year. And so what happens is, regardless of that number that we bring, it's based off the current number of juniors who are on a tuition waiver who won't be with us for the following year. So there's always a number of students that move after that board meeting in January. And so this year that number is 6. So 6 students after the board meeting in January who were juniors moved. And so, having them come back for their last year seems like it might be appropriate. So we thought we'd come back to you and ask to see if that would be something you'd be interested in, letting the 6 seniors come back for their final year.
Any questions for Aaron or Caitlin? Now we would look for a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any additional comments or questions? Not all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, get to finish out here in West Allis, West Milwaukee. That's great. Thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to item 10.2, the approval of teacher computer device lease.
So I am going to share my screen. Just go through a brief PowerPoint here. Okay. Are you seeing the computer refresh PowerPoint? Awesome. Okay. So this is an agreement with Apple, and they call it a MacBook lease purchase agreement, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer because really it's a financing agreement. We do own the devices at the end of the agreement, which is 4 years. So just some information on this. It is a routine update for our teacher computers, which we do about every 5 years. The Apple protocol in the lease agreement requires that the board approves the lease agreement. This is not per our own district policies. This is specific to Apple. So we do have half of our devices are Dell devices, and that lease agreement was not needed to be board approved. So that one's already moving through, and we're ordering the Dell devices. But the Apple protocol does require that the board approves this agreement. The update of the teacher devices is imperative with our virtual learning plan, especially because our teachers will be all starting virtual in the beginning of the year. And then who knows how long those phases will take to implement. So certainly in the beginning of the year, all of our teachers will be virtual. And this will really help with implementing the new learning management system, as they'll have devices that are just higher functioning, newer devices to work off of. And then also it supports our employee engagement within our strategic plan that we are supporting our teachers and giving them the devices that they need to be successful in teaching our students. This is the second time we're renewing our lease for our Mac teacher computers. So just like our previous leases, our Dell lease did not go through board approval, but our Mac did per the Apple protocol. So we wanted to provide a little bit of background because we anticipated that this question might come up, but why Macbooks for the elementary and PCs for the secondary? And this was based on surveys that we did in 2016. Our leadership and learning team put together a questionnaire that went to our teachers, and therefore they concluded which devices were needed for our students. And then based off of that, we purchased the devices that would support, where teachers could support our student learning at those various grade levels. So our Macbooks are at the elementary, and our PCs are at the secondary, and the device cost difference is only $125 from one to the other. I think a lot of us think that MacBooks are much more expensive, but in reality that the cost is not the main driver in which device we're getting because they're relatively close. And then the continuation of this lease provides consistency this year, especially with so much change going on, that our teachers can maintain the same devices that they're used to using for their students. So the MacBook lease purchase agreement is for 415 Macs, which will be financed over 4 years. There's an impressively low interest rate of 0.99%. Our previous lease agreement was 1.69, which we thought was low at the time. So this is even better. Our cost is included and approved within the preliminary budget. And then it also includes a 4-year Apple Care program which assists in if there is any reason for our device to be, if it's broken or there's problems with the battery and things like that, we can send it back to Apple. And they do charge a fee when we send it back, but it's not as much often as the actual fix would cost. And then at the end of the lease, our district will own the computers. It's a $1 purchase. So essentially we own the computers at the end of the lease. And that's all we have. So any questions on that?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Gary.
Caitlin, can you stop sharing them for a second? Because otherwise I can't see everybody. Thank you.
So, Caitlin, as you know, I asked you a series of questions today, and I think I sent the link to all participants. A lot of my questions are going to be based on information in this article. So Apple Computer, try to be as less technical as I can, is changing what's called their CPU architecture. They used to be what was called Intel-based architecture. They're going to be moving to ARM-based architecture. Their target was fall of 2020, but they may not make it. And it's a significant change for Apple. So one of the questions I asked Caitlin was when we would get these computers. And Caitlin, you said we get all 421 at one time, correct?
Correct. Yep. And I do have Bruce and Frone joining us from technology too. So they're able to answer some of Gary's technical questions that he's going to ask. But yes, we would get them all at one time this fall.
Do we know in the agreement where I'm assuming we would be shipped the Intel based Macs?
Yes, that is correct. We would get the Intel based.
Okay. So question I have, if we were to delay the Apple lease this year, didn't lease this year and waited to lease next year, how would that impact us?
Well, these Macs that the teachers currently have are over 5 years old, and the battery life is starting to go on some of these. So it would impact them as far as the battery life, and also as far as speed. The new ones that we would be getting will be twice as fast as what the teachers currently have. And I've read based on what Apple says, and they will still continue to support the Intel even after they go to the new CPU architecture. So I don't see the real advantage postponing it for our teachers to make sure that we have devices that they can utilize, especially in this new learning environment of the virtual learning.
I would disagree on that. I think Apple's move is significant. To go into their own ARM architecture. And so a delay would mean if we were to delay this, teachers we'd have to support other hardware for a year longer. But it would give us the advantage of seeing where Apple is in their roadmap to getting their ARM-based Macs out into the world, and possibility of getting ARM-based Macs, because 4 years from now, the ARM-based Macs are going to be the Macs you want, not the Intel Macs.
Right. But again, like I said, our devices that the teachers would be using this school year are over 5 years old. So we're already having issues with some of them, and it would just mean we would have continuing issues with them.
What would be do we have an idea what the additional cost would be to maintain these for one more year, or even if it were 6 months to get, Apple to agree on possibly providing the ARM-based Macs instead of the Intel?
I don't have, go ahead.
The basic battery replacement for one of our MacBook Airs without sending it out is roughly $150. So I would assume at least 30% of our fleet would require replaced batteries, which then would require staff to come in to exchange that device, have the battery swapped out,
and then reissue that device to that staff member. I don't believe investing $150 in 5-year-old technology is a good route to go. The ARM definitely has some advantages coming up, but the disadvantages is actually, Gary, I was reading your article that you sent out. It says that it looks like they narrowed up support for Thunderbolt, but I've been reading rumors that Intel and Apple are still fighting over patent use for the Thunderbolt technology, which could also delay the release of the new MacBook Airs, which is usually slotted for March-ish of every year. Their current release would be for their larger new platform, their MacBook, which is between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, which would also be a significant price increase over the MacBook Airs that we're currently looking at.
Okay. So we don't have a cost estimate on what it would take to replace the batteries?
It's $150 per battery. And I estimate about 30% are going to have battery issues on top of, go ahead.
What number is that?
Of our current fleet, we ordered 405 originally. So I would say about 135-ish would need battery replacements.
So that's about $20,000.
And again, I agree with Bruce of not having to put that kind of money in that old of a technology. To me, doesn't make sense.
The other thing is we are outside of our AppleCare agreement currently. The AppleCare usually didn't cover the batteries, which is one of the reasons for the cost. Also, we're outside of our AppleCare warranty, which means any hardware issues that occur now fall on repair on the district, versus the new any new purchases would be covered by AppleCare for 4 years.
Right.
Do we under the Apple agreement ever looked at the ability to spread out the number of machines we receive? So you would receive a certain number of machines this year to replace the ones that we feel have to be replaced, and then we get newer equipment in future years.
No, we've usually, when we refresh, we do, like last year we did the administrative staff, and then this year we're looking to do the teacher staff. So we usually do the whole group at one time, because then some of your teachers would have older technology and some of your teachers would have newer technology. And we'd like to keep them all on the same type of technology.
Okay.
Gary, are you done for now? I'm going to come back to you if you have more questions after. Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay. Oh, go ahead. You, Noah.
Sorry, you said me, right?
I'm
Sorry.
pointing at you.
I wasn't sure if you saw me before. So my question is in regards to the owning the equipment after the lease is done. So was that the case this last time? And if it is, what are we doing with the old equipment?
Yes, that is the case. After the lease is done, we own the equipment. And typically what we do is we go through the schools and see where the greatest need is, and we repurpose those old computers. Some of our technology is quite old, so then we get rid of the real old technology, we replace it with the old teacher computers, and then we recycle the really old technology. So we always repurpose them.
Okay, so they're staying in district still.
Correct. We don't get rid of them. They always stay within district, and they're repurposed throughout the district.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Kristen, did you have a question as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure it was clear for maybe public who's not here, who aren't aware. This is already budgeted for, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Any other board member questions? If not, we will look for a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any additional comments or questions? If not, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed?
Opposed.
All right, thank you very much. We'll then move on to item 10.3, the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook.
Everyone. So this is our Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, which historically, although there are parts of it that are board approved, like the Code of Conduct that's inserted into the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, the handbook as a whole has not come forward to the board in an annual process for approval prior to this year. And it was something, as we have been working with Neola on updating policies and some of our procedures, that they had recommended that we do. And so we are bringing it forward this year for board approval. So what I did with it, and I will share screen so that we can look at them, is just went through and took out the comparison pieces from the handbook from last year to this year. And this was something that we talked about at our committee meeting. A couple of these are updated even since the committee meeting, as we did get some of that information from Title IX. As well as then we'll talk about the addendum that we are adding to the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook due to the specifics around managing COVID. So from 1920 to 2021, one of the changes is just simply the update to our mission and vision that we did as a process. The thing I didn't include in here is that there are administrators at our buildings and board members that get updated each year as they're featured in the first few pages of the handbook. On pages 24 and 25, we've updated some of the language to include things around online classrooms and activities, as those weren't previously spelled out when it came to our language around bullying in the classroom or some of the language around harassment. So we wanted to be sure that students and families understood that the rules of the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook do apply to virtual instruction, not only during this time, but other times throughout the year when students are participating in activities that are focused online. And then as we keep going through, there's a couple of these that are simple updates to phone numbers and things like that that change from year to year. We did add some language that not only do families have access to Skyward, but we also added some language that includes our learning management system. And we want our families to get familiar with that as well, as that will be a big communication tool for us throughout the course of the next school year, especially. And in the course of the following school years as well, as we've extended that contract. And then I'll keep going. So those were a couple of phone numbers. This was something we talked about quite a bit as a committee. And Marty, I might ask you to jump in here as well, as we've talked about this one quite a bit. School resource officers on our Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. The previous language is in there, and then the current language that we have updated to reflect some of the partnership and collaboration, especially that we've done with the West Dallas Police Department in the last several years. Marty and I have been meeting with them pretty regularly. We had some plans to do some cross training in the spring, with myself going and working with some of the police officers and the police officers attending some of our training, but obviously that all got delayed. But we thought it was really important to note that really our school resource officers have been doing training with us for several years around not just intervention in the event of a criminal act, but also really working to connect the community and the school. Our resource officers are frequently, they know some of the students from the community. They're seen as a support for many of our students. One of our resource officers is listed quite regularly when we ask students, who is a person that you have at school that you trust, that you could go to with a problem. Many times there's a couple of our buildings where our school resource officer is the person who's listed a lot. And they do a lot of that community relations work. So we thought it was really important to add that language to this section, as well as add the highlighted section about working collaboratively with the police to do cross-training and support. We've shared our equity non-negotiables with our school resource officers, as well as the leaders in the West Dallas Police Department, as our belief statements that guide our work. And so we thought it was really important to update the language in our Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook so that the community is aware that we are working very closely with those resource officers, and especially our West Dallas Police. We also work with the West Milwaukee Police and the resource officer that we have from the West Milwaukee Police, but as they're a much smaller police force, we don't work with them quite as regularly on cross training and things like that. And we don't have as much contact with the New Berlin Police as they cover the jurisdiction of Hoover. as regularly, but we have worked with them in collaboration in the past. So that's why it's specifically spelled out about the West Allis Police in the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. Ernie, anything you want to add to that one?
So you did a very nice job covering it. And you know, there is a lot of attention right now on the role of police officers in schools, and we're sensitive to that. And we're going to keep working with our police department and with, you know, our school communities and students in particular. And if things need to evolve over time, we'll have those conversations. But at this time, we feel pretty good about our relationships with our police departments. You know, the West Allis Police Department had a number of representatives that participated in our big community conversation. So that was in 3 days with expert facilitation, and they were hard, honest, raw conversations at times. But in the end, the process is exactly what the group that facilitated promised, is that there was a much deeper sense of community. And, you know, and I have a different set of relationships and respect for our SROs that sat in that room with us as we worked through really difficult moments together over 3 days, 3 full days. And so there's a set of connections that we can leverage. And even if we need to make changes, I think those relationships will help us evolve that work. But right now we feel good about where we are.
And I'll just add to that we've also worked really closely with our administrators so that they truly understand what's the intent of the community resource officer, which really is to bridge a lot of those community relations. It's helpful that our students who might see an officer as a challenge at the park or have an experience at the park on the weekend that comes back into school, that officer really does help us bridge some of the gap between some of those conflicts that arise outside of school that sometimes spill their way over into school as well. So we've worked really hard with our administrators on really understanding the role and that intent of that role, which is different than acting as a disciplinarian in the schools. That's not what we intend when we work with our community resource officers. So the next one is an addition, and this was not something that we talked about at committee, so this is new to the committee tonight, was we've been updating all of our processes as best we can and our procedures to try to get ready to minimize contact in any way possible going into the fall. So we've added some options for online registration, and so Beth is still working on those, and so that's why you'll see directions here, and then there will be a link to all of that in the coming weeks as she gets all of that process and the details worked out. And then the next one down was an addition from food service that students can, when they can put cash on their lunch accounts instead of it being accepted during lunch, which is creating another whole complication for the team right now. So that was some updated language from our food service team. The next one is also an update since committee. So part of, as we're discovering what the expectations are for Title IX, Jeff and I met to discuss what really should be in the handbook right now. And as Marty said, we are likely to get some additional guidance as far as what else needs to get added to our employee handbook, to our student rights and responsibilities handbook over the course of the next year. But one of the things that was really clear that needs to get added right away is a very explicit place where who your Title IX coordinator is identified with contact information for them. So Jeff's name, and he also added it to the chat tonight in case people have questions about Title IX, is spelled out a little bit more clearly. It was in there before, but some of the language was harder to read and harder to find. So we wanted to have that have a more prominent location. This next one is another relatively large addition to the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook for this year. The top section where it talks about the property of the district and expectations of privacy has not changed. It says right in the language that users should have no expectation of privacy and the contents of any communications or files on district technology, resources, individual storage systems, or web resources unless such expectation is granted by law. So that, I won't read the whole paragraph to you, obviously, but that is where the language spells out that when the students are using our devices and when the students are using their school email and all of those things, that they shouldn't expect to be able to keep things in there and have a right to privacy, that they are district owned and they are part of the communications that we put back and forth. And so therefore they are things that we can monitor, and we do occasionally monitor when there's been a significant disciplinary incident, or when a student reports that a student has sent them something to them electronically that was inappropriate or unsafe. We do have gone into their accounts and found out that information, as we are well entitled to do under the law to keep kids safe. What we've added this year is something called Gaggle. And what Gaggle will do, it's a safety management system. It uses a combination of artificial intelligence and then some safety experts to actually filter and look for keywords in the communication that students put back and forth between Google Docs and anything tied to their Google suite of devices. So if it's a Google presentation, a Google slide, all of those types of things, it will filter for those things, and then it'll send an alert to the principal and then members of our district office student services team. So myself, Nick Burr, Sabin, and Laura Sage, so that we can intervene and provide help to the student. It'll especially look for things that are signs of self-harm, signs of suicide, depression, substance abuse, cyberbullying, and then it also looks for credible threats of violence. So if any of those things come through electronically, it'll send us an alert and allow us to go in and investigate quicker than waiting for a student or a parent to sometimes find those weeks later and report them back to us. We did a bit of a trial run with Gaggle in the winter, which feels like 5 years ago at the present moment, but in the winter, and they came back with a series of things that they had picked up in the communications. Many of them we had already known about and addressed, but there were a couple that were concerning students' personal safety and some suicidal ideation and some depression that we hadn't previously been reported. So we were thankful that there was an avenue to catch some of those things that kids may be putting in writing that they aren't necessarily saying out loud to an adult. And especially right now, as we go into virtual learning for the at the present moment for as long as we need to be based on the health metrics, and as we need to be on and off throughout the year, we felt like adding the addition of Gaggle for a safety measure was important. And so that also language then went into the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. Okay. And I'll make some time at the end for questions. I promise we're not that far off. And I think we'll have some questions on the COVID addendum as well. So I'll do this one and then take some questions, and then we'll jump over to the addendum. This next one on page 51 is just the language around sexual harassment that the Title IX requirement has asked us to explicitly spell out. So we added it to our glossary of terms so that we were clear in the expectations under Title IX of what we needed to have in the handbook. And that ends the changes from last year to this year. We did update a couple of the annual notices with just some new requirements as they're coming up. The reason those are annual notices are kind of live links is so that families, when they go to click on those, have the most updated information versus being cut and pasted and put into the employee handbook, or excuse me, the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. So I'm going to stop share for a second and take any questions on that portion of it. And then we'll go in and do the COVID addendum. It was important to us to keep those separate because the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook gets a sign off as normal, and then the addendum gets a sign off, meaning that if there were things that we needed to change specific to COVID throughout the year, we can just get the addendum re-signed by each family without having to update the entire handbook. So that's why we're keeping them separate as two separate documents. Okay, so questions on the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook?
All right. So first, thank you for the comparison. It makes it a lot easier than trying to go through and looking at red language, or, you know, that was kind of done in the past sometimes. So comparison, very useful. So thank you for that. And I also just think that the forms and fees, getting them online is something that I've heard about for a number of years trying to do. And it's an unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in, that it's finally getting done, but I think it will be a useful thing for years to come to be able to do forms and fees online. So I just wanted to make that comment as well. So the only question I had was regarding Gaggle. I could see some parents wanting to opt out of that for their students. Is that a possibility?
No, it is not a possibility to opt out of Gaggle because it's part of now using the G Suite of devices, and it falls under that protections under privacy. The law or the ruling around the protection or the right to privacy at school hasn't changed. This is just a tool added really for the student safety so that we can get notified more quickly if there is a reason for us to wrap a plan of support around a student and make sure that they have what they need. It's also why we were really specific that it gets the notices on that get directed just to our core student services team, our leaders at our district office and the principal, because each one, we want to make sure we're really evaluating to say, we don't want to alarm anybody by something that's in there without making sure that we've used thoughtful process around it. But we also want to intervene if we need to, if there's been a reason to, in order to support a student and keep them safe.
Okay, thank you.
Anything from the committee that worked on this? Bill, do you guys have anything else to add to the comparison or to anything else that you guys discussed that maybe didn't come up in teacher's presentation?
No, but I thought, my thoughts on the Gaggle at first was a little like, okay, overwhelming. What are we doing here? But as we talk through it with the committee, there is no expectation of privacy when you're using our stuff. So as long as the parents understand and know, I think that if we help just one student and we find, one student that has maybe a suicidal thought and we catch one, it's well worth it. So with the expectation of no privacy, I think I'm definitely okay with this tool.
And to be fair, that was in place before. This is just another filter, right, on top of that. So the expectation of no privacy was always an expectation and an understanding. It's just this is another resource in order to ensure student safety.
Yeah, and that was part of our discussion, like Bill is saying, at committee. Okay. And Kristen, if you want to jump in as well, right? That was a chunk of the discussion, like that this isn't new, the right to, the students not having that right to privacy on the devices and on the tools. It's really just that layer of a filter for us to catch kids who need us. And we're always looking for new ways to grab and make plans of support around students who need especially mental health care in schools. That's been really important to us as a district for a long time. And the board has been really supportive of all of our efforts around adding mental health care in the last several years. And so, especially in the time that we're having right now, that's a lot of the concern in the broader community as well, with kids not having that physical contact with one another. And so it's an especially important time to be watching for those signs of mental health concerns and then trying to direct students to support and families to support as best that we can and as quickly as we can. This Gaggle just helps us expedite the process of knowing.
Kristen?
Yeah, and I just want for folks to hear as well that, my first concern was, well, what if it's a creative writing and the kids are writing something? It might not, it might be a little more mature than we expect, but it happens. We're using this tool also to just, like Bill said, we help one kid who's having a struggle. That's fine. It's not going to be used only solely for disciplinary. If kids are doing research, everyone who's in charge of getting the information is going to be really smart about, all right, well, let's just double check what this is first, and then we'll go from there. And I just want to make sure people are aware that wasn't also discussed.
Mm-hmm.
All right, then I'm going to share screen again so that we can look at the COVID addendum. And so I'll start with this one by saying our legal team are the first ones who wrote this and then sent it to Marty and myself, and then we had a chance to review it, and then we did take it to committee. I want to thank Noah, who then took a really hard look at it, and even between when the lawyers wrote it the first time and when we are bringing it forward tonight, there was a little language, some of the language around the masks that was inconsistent then. And so I've done a strike through in here just so we can see where it was different than what was sent out on Friday. And then there's a link in there that I also have to update. So I'll kind of just go through it step by step, and then we'll answer any questions at the end. And so obviously the top just kind of explains why we have an addendum. The student expectations in virtual learning. And so the first one is that we want the kids to participate in the video conferencing whenever they're available to. It's been important to us to have videos of things that for students who cannot participate during the day for whatever the family reason is. But also we want to encourage students who are able to participate during that video conferencing time live wherever and whenever they can. That students should try to be in a quiet environment that's conducive to learning, wherever that is in their household or whatever means that they can best do to think about that kind of learning space. They should wear clothing that aligns to our dress code. And so there's been quite a bit of conversation in some of the online communities on what kids are required to wear to video conferencing sessions on Zoom or on Google Meets and all of those things, and what they're not required to wear. And we've just said, stay consistent with our dress code as best you can. Our rules and policies still follow during the video conferencing time. But if our students show up in pajamas, that's okay. Sometimes we let them wear pajamas to school for fun events as well. And so there's things like that that we are not intending to police in any kinds of ways. We're thankful that our students are participating. And so as long as the clothing is appropriate for school, meaning it doesn't have sayings on it that we can't support in the student dress code, or it's not distracting and inappropriate, then that's obviously, it's how they showed up that day, and that's what we want to support. And then they should just be cautious about what's visible in the background. You know, you can set your background screen to be something else if there are things in the background that are not appropriate for school, as you know, things that sometimes are in our homes are not the things that we would bring into school. So we just want students and families to be cognizant of what they can see in the background on when they participate in video conferencing from their home, as well as for younger students that the parents may want to be present to help with technology as appropriate. So that would be something that, you know, we want to encourage families to do. That the code of conduct still applies, that some of the therapies and individualized instruction happen in small group settings. And so we want the families to understand that when those are happening, much like we are only videotaping the teacher for student privacy reasons, we are saying to families, please don't record a small group conversation or a therapy session or a small group session while you're engaged in the virtual learning and publish that somewhere, or take screenshots and put them out into the world. Kids have teachers know to not do student identifying information when they're recording something that goes on to then for the asynchronous time later on, but students will say things about one another that are personally identifying to each other. And so we have to be really careful about publishing that information in the evenings. And we want to make sure families understand it is our expectation that you're not videotaping children in those settings and then putting it out into the world for people to see and view, as it may be identifying for a student and therefore not always safe. That will record lessons for view at a later date, but they'll only record themselves and not the students or the images. District staff will be able to communicate with students during our normal work hours. And if they have questions about virtual instruction, they should contact the school principal. And that was originally, there was a suggestion in there about contacting somebody in our district office. But by the time somebody contacts Jeff or myself or somebody else from our team, then we're pretty far away from being able to intervene quickly at the school level. And so we always want our problems to be resolved as best they can at the lowest level. And so contacting the principal if there's a concern about the third hour teacher or what's happening at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in a session, really it should start with the principal. And if it can't get resolved from there, we have a process of filing a parent complaint that goes to Jeff Thompson, so then he can get involved to really get a resolution for the family and the student and the teachers and the staff. And then we still follow, again, our code of conduct, our bullying policies, reporting child abuse and neglect, our student non-discrimination, student rights policies, and technology. Those are all still applicable in the setting. For special education services, and again, a communication is going out to those families very shortly. I know we talked about that in our last meeting as well. And we've had some new updates from the Department of Public Instruction and some new instructions from our lawyers we are working with very closely that delayed that communication getting out to families. So we should have that out to families very shortly. But it basically says that we will hold IEPs and 504 meetings anytime that there's a question about some of the services being provided to a student, to resolve that with the family for each individual child. And then there's some DPI forms that get filled out and completed so that we can make sure that we're being compliant with a free and appropriate public education for all learners, but especially our learners who have disabilities. Reporting of suspected child abuse and neglect, that stayed, that's again, that will report things to the Department of Children and Family Services as we normally would, as we follow the guidance given to us by them and some of our joint protocols. That will follow the health and safety guidelines of the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, the emergency orders from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. This next one is the duty to report. And so this is who the student is going to call if they have been tested positive or been exposed in given the guidelines that we have around exposure. And that we have landed at, they're going to contact our school nursing office. So that way we can keep track of the reports across our district from one central location. And then our nurses they work already super closely with our local health department, but they can continue to do that to be sure that we're following everything we need to do when it comes to reporting of cases of positive tests as well as exposure. And then we can make the appropriate decisions from there. We are telling families that if they have questions about their medical care or what they should do next, if they do identify symptoms, that they should contact their personal health care provider. And not to contact our school nurses to ask them necessarily for medical advice in that moment, but please follow the guidance of your own healthcare provider, whoever you are. That next section is on student travel. And so the requirements to report if students are traveling really the guidance that we get from the Milwaukee County Health Department, the West Dallas Health Department, and the Center for Disease Control, similar to the same places we are referencing for the metrics for the phases. So we wanted that language to be consistent. This one needs an updated link. That was something that Noah pointed out to me, so thank you. And so that I will update after the meeting as soon as I get a second to get in there. And then the daily self-screening. So this is where we are asking families to do that self-check on symptoms of COVID and report to us daily on them doing that self-check and checking in with us each day so that we can, again, kind of give guidance and make sure that we're reporting exposure and having students self-isolate if that is required or if that is recommended under the guidance that we're given. And then the last one are expectations of kids at school. So stay home if you're sick, extra sanitizing, wash your hands, don't touch your face and your eyes whenever possible. Bring in your own water bottle. So we won't have the bubblers just on in schools when we have students coming in the next phases, when we have students coming back into schools. Our buildings that have those water filling stations, those will still be open because you can do those with no contact, but not all of our buildings have those yet. So those will be available. Following directions is really important to identify. It's always important for safety reasons that kids follow directions, but especially right now, if we need to move or isolate or do any of those things based on the health recommendations, we want to make sure that families know that we really need our students to be following the instructions in that moment. And it really is for their safety and the safety of others. Okay, so the next, and then practicing safe distancing, that we're going to do our very best to stay the 6 feet away from one another, including in the hallways and outside. If social distancing is not possible, you should be wearing a mask. And that is also language that we'll update because we, right now, under the governor's orders, we'll all be wearing the mask, but also what the board approved in the framework was that students should be wearing their mask inside. So that is another little piece of the language that we'll update. And that'll be a strike through. So that'll be eliminated from the document when it goes out to families. And then the next paragraph as well, just we updated some of the language that really, it's only when you're eating and drinking and then engaging in strenuous activity. So that really is related to sports at the present moment because we're giving different guidance for PE classes. But that is if I am active, if volleyball is allowed or football is allowed and I'm active in those situations, in the middle of a match or a game, we wouldn't also have somebody in a face mask. That's what's right now the definition of strenuous. But if there were other times where I wasn't actively engaged in those activities, the expectation would be that I'd have a mask on or a face covering. All right, and then we will provide mask breaks to students throughout the day. We know that it's a challenge, especially for our youngest learners, to keep that mask on for the full day. So those would be following the guidance that we've been given, which is hopefully outside for as long as the weather will allow, where we have students still spaced out and in a space where it would be an okay time to be having your mask off. And then putting them right back on to be coming back into the space, into the school. And then if you're found to be in violation of the policies and the practices, that we will reassign the student to the virtual learning program. And so that's been the guidance that we've talked about before, that if we have students who are just choosing not to follow the rules within the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook when it comes to social distancing and wearing the mask, then we would assign them to the virtual learning option that we're making available to all families. High risk students, we're almost to the end, I promise. I feel like I'm reading a novel to everyone this evening. But high risk students, so these are students who may be a student with a medical condition that doesn't normally require an individualized education program as a student with a disability at school. But under these circumstances, that student is really high risk and therefore cannot return to school even when other students might at the 2 and 4 or 5 day options as we go forward. So this basically says if there's a significant reason that a student is high risk, that they call the school and do an MTSS meeting as normal, and then we'll evaluate whether or not there's additional things we need to do in those situations to ensure that that student is able to participate in instruction. And then student illnesses at school, this is just that we'll isolate and send students home. Attendance, and Kristen sent me a question about this today. So attendance is, as of right now, following the guidance that's in the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. We did get the information on the potential waivers on, I want to say Thursday or Friday. Marty, if you remember which day we got that on. And so I started reading all of that guidance today so that we'll know which waivers we might want to choose to apply for the 2021 school year. But as it sits today, we don't have a waiver in place for some of those things. So the policies stay as is. Then if we choose to apply for a waiver for things, it allows us to go away from what we've put in some of these documents. Kristen's question, just so everybody knows, was just around working with families and trying to support them as students may get ill from COVID and therefore need more than the normal 10 days allowable under the habitual truancy laws, as well as just some of the ins and outs of exposure. And of course, we're going to do our very best to support our learners and our families in any way we can right now. We know how much flexibility that's going to take on both ends. We want kids knowing that if you're not feeling well, if you've been exposed, please stay home and participate virtually. And, we have that option for you if you're well enough to do so. But of course, we're going to work really closely with families as they have concerns. The one thing we ask the families to do is communicate with us regularly too, so that we know what's happening and we can figure out what some of the best supports are to families. Visitors. So we are obviously encouraging limiting visitors as much as humanly possible. We talked today to our PTA president about volunteers in schools and things like that, and maybe sending home activities volunteers can do from home, and not having any extra people in the buildings as best we can. But for visitors who need to come to schools, so for example, a representative from the Department of Children and Families who might need to come to a school to meet with a student, then we expect them to do the same screening that we're asking other people to do, and not to come into schools if they've been exposed or they don't meet some of the guidance that would make it as safe as possible. Confidentiality and privacy, that is directly from the statute. And it basically, in this situation, is just that acknowledgement that we want to make sure that we're not publicizing any student confidential information by inadvertently grabbing something in a recording during a Zoom session or something like that. So it's really making sure that we're paying attention to the privacy and the safety reasons that we keep a lot of student information confidential in schools. Is that last one and what it was asking us for. And then basically the acknowledgement that the family has signed off on this. And these will be made electronic signatures for both the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. They were last year as well. And this will also be, this is not print off a paper and hand sign it and send it back. We'll do the signatures electronically. Okay, that's the end of that one. So I will stop sharing screen and answer any questions. Yeah, Noah?
So for the visitor, who are we gonna, normally in schools, parents are encouraged to come whenever they want to. Are we going to now basically say in this situation, we don't want parents to come unless there's like a extremely good reason for doing that? We're not gonna have parents in classrooms, observing their students.
Yes, that is our intention. No, and I don't know, we didn't make as strong of a statement in there, Marty, in the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, but that's certainly been the discussion so far, is that we want to keep the foot traffic in schools to the absolute minimum amount. The best we can do that, the more likely it is we get to stay open for the families that are comfortable with the 2-day or 4 and 5-day options as we get further into the phases. So that's always the goal.
That's exactly correct. And we even had a conversation today with PTA council and the help PTA, folks that want to do volunteering in schools because they love that part of it, to help them figure out how we have them do it virtually. Literally, teachers create packets that can then go to a PTA volunteer. They do the work at home and the materials come back, right? So even our traditional volunteers were saying not right now.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that would be clear. I know for some parents that might be difficult when we start moving back into school. It's probably more of a norm for them to be in school buildings, multiple days a week. But on these circumstances, we do have to make those sacrifices to ensure that we can stay open as much as possible. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
And no, I'm going to make a note on that as well, because we do have a visitor policy. And so, Marty, we might need to revisit that one right now, because I think our visitor policy and what we're saying about visitors, I think we might need to update that one. So I've made a note of that as well, so that we can make sure that we're very clear in the expectation.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I had brought up about the other language regarding the mask. You said you were going to strike through that one region that wasn't struck through. I just want to make sure that it's clear. We don't want people saying, well, it says here that, and then but we said something else. So I'm glad to see that.
I appreciated you catching that one, actually, because again, we've looked at these documents hundreds of times, and we're getting updated guidance from our attorneys on a pretty regular basis. And so it's good to have that extra pair of eyes on that one. So thank you.
Happy to help.
So just to jump on the visitor thing real quick. So in my experience, a lot of the people who come to the schools daily to do things in classrooms are not at all affiliated with PTA. There's parents that come in to do different things. So ensuring that we're having communication come from the principals, the families as well, to say, you used to come and sit in your kid's second grade class and do reading time. We're not doing that now, and here's why. There's a lot of other people that come in and are not affiliated with any of the organized volunteering. So.
As we look at our visitor policy, we can also follow that up if that one's been updated, also with some just general guidance and communication to families as well. And to our administrators, because they're used to the policy as it states right now.
Right, they're going to be the gatekeepers and the school secretaries and stuff as well. So, yeah. Noah, did you have another question?
Yeah, just a follow up to that, actually. I guess what would the process be in this situation if there was a parent or, basically someone who doesn't have like an official professional reason for being in a building, but what process would they have to go through to get approval? Who are they going to the principal to get that approval? And then other principals being given the criteria for which they can do it, because you don't want to start, well, I heard so-and-so could come in because of XYZ reason, so now I want to come in too. Or even between buildings having that being a problem. So maybe having some criteria that are across the board. These are the reasons why you could come in for to the building, and ensure that those are being upheld and then communicated to the families that way. So like if I need to come in, I know I got to call this person and then confirm these are the reasons, and then I'm on a list that says on this day around this time I'm going to be able to come in to do XYZ things.
I will add that to the list.
Other questions?
I have some
Gary?
questions. Okay. So at the very beginning, it says the following procedures and guidelines are applicable during these emergency periods while in-person operations are altered or suspended. How does that equate to the phases in the framework?
Altered and for an extent, sorry, I'm just rereading it, Gary, so I can make sure I'm getting your question. Yeah, so that is the difference between when under normal circumstances, we might amend the day or the schedule without re-notifying all of the parents or changing any of the rules. And so it does apply. Our lawyers, as they wrote that language, are aware of the phases. Each one is an alteration of the quote unquote normal school day. So hopefully I'm answering that question correctly, but the lawyers knew that was the phases, and as we were phasing those in, when we added that language, and they're the ones who had advised us that.
So is it possible that this, then you could say it applies through all 5 phases, that it apply through phases 1 to 4, and then when we get to phase 5, maybe these don't apply?
It would apply to all of the phases, and it's likely going to apply to the whole school year, because we do have some families that are choosing to remain virtual for the year. So they're still under these rules, even as students kind of phase back into school throughout the course of the year. So we really are under, that family is having an extended, I don't want to say extended closure, but that family is having a different learning experience than some of the other families when we get to phase 5. And so we want to be sure we're covered on both ends.
And it's another example. It's also true that some families that have picked the 2-day learning option, so whether that's phase 2 or 3, depending on elementary or secondary, and will remain 2-day, just as a safety precautions. They want their children engaged somewhat in school, but also want to minimize the risk. And so this, this language anticipates that dynamic as we go forward.
Okay. Then I have another question related to where it says, the individual has traveled by mass transit either domestically or internationally within 14 days. So under this, would something like MCTS be considered public transit defined under here?
So I'm going to share screen again, Gary, because some of that language changed, and I apologize. I think when Marty gave you access to the document, he might have not given you the access to the document with some of the changes. So
I'm using the PDF document.
Yep. And so that has had some updates for, I think, exactly the reason you're asking the question. We have quite a few students who travel on mass transit to get to and from school. So the language, and I'm going to make this bigger just so that everybody can see it. My new skill I've learned how to do in Zoom and sharing. So this is the section on student travel. And this is the one where I shared I have to update the link still. I apologize, I didn't get to that yet, but it will continue to follow the guidance when it comes to travel from the health agencies. And so not defining it as clearly as it was in the original document that we were looking at.
Okay. And then not quite mass transit in the sense that people think of mass transit, but the use of a mass transit type vehicle, a school bus. If we have situations where, let's say first student, I'll pick on them. First student transports students during the day, and then they take a bus and they use that bus to maybe sports are going on in fall, and they transport students on a bus that was used earlier to transport students. They're going to use that to transport athletes to an athletic event. Would that be considered mass transit if they don't take the proper cleaning procedures before they load these athletes on the bus?
I don't know if you want to jump in on that one, Marty, or if you want me to.
So it's an interesting question, Gary. I think the way we would interpret it, and I'm pretty confident the way our attorneys would interpret it, is that the bus service for a student is a contracted service, so it wouldn't apply as a mass transit service, which is open to anybody in the public. And so this is limited access in terms of, because it's contracted just for student transportation, whether that's school day or athletic participation. So I think that creates the difference.
Okay, is it possible to get some kind of language in? Or do we feel that's not needed?
We felt that it wasn't needed, and I did talk to this one. I actually spoke to our attorney at length on this one because I wasn't 100% sure on the mass transit language that was in their original document. And the attorney felt really comfortable that this covers us to be able to say there's guidance around what defines travel within the health guidance that we're following. And so we are going to be consistent with the expectations of those health experts within our communities. She felt really confident that that covered it. And she actually said that kind of covers it a little better than some of the ways that it was worded before. So I believe we're covered based on that.
Okay. Then it also states all students will wear masks, cloth, face coverings at all times, except when eating, drinking, or engaging in strenuous physical activity, including whenever transitioning between classes in the hallway, in common areas of the building, or when passing close to others where close contact may be unavoidable. So how are we defining transitioning between classes?
And I will share screen one more time. I put that language in a strike through in here because, again, as the documents are evolving very quickly, that's language that we'll remove. So the new language will actually, pending approval by the board tonight, will actually have that language around including transitioning between classes in the hallway and common areas of the building, or when passing close to others where close contact is unavoidable. That language is missing. It is our expectation that you are wearing a mask or a face covering at all times, except when you're eating or drinking or engaged in strenuous activity. Like I said, when you're in the middle of a volleyball tournament and you're swinging the volleyball back and forth, it's not the guidance right now that you would be wearing a mask while you engaged in that level of activity.
Okay.
So I apologize for the confusion on that, Gary. But yeah, we did take the strike through language to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Other questions? Teacher, did you guys have any conversations with ADs or any other conversations with regards to having student athletes wear gaiters or something during strenuous activity? I mean, they are breathable. You can, they make them with school colors. You can, I mean, there's an option for that. Is that something that we considered as not having as a strike through?
We have not considered that. Go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, those are ongoing conversations in the AD meetings. And consistently it's, as they define strenuous activity, I think it's when kids are really engaged in direct competition, and whether or not that's going to be viable, or whether or not a mask or a gaiter mask impedes performance. A bunch of unknowns. But the final questions are still waiting for more WIAA guidance, and the ongoing conversations among ADs. It's just not settled yet.
And that's the other reason that this language is also in an addendum, because there might be times throughout the year where we need to send up updated language in this. And then again, we're only having families then re-sign the commitment to what's in the addendum. We wouldn't expect any changes to the student rights and responsibilities handbook, right? Once that's signed, it's set for the year. We will be collecting notes about things that change throughout the year and having further conversation on anything else the board said, oh, hey, as I had a chance to review it more, I have a question on what's on this page with our committee before we bring it forward to the next year. So each year it'll get updated based on all kinds of information that's out there. There's some information from the WIAA around sports to add to athletic handbooks, around peaceful protests and things like that, our group may want to consider adding to our student rights and responsibilities handbook as well. But for now, this is as up to date as the document can be with all the information that we have, again, with our attorneys. But that is the reason it's in its own document, so that we might have to get this one signed a few times this year, depending on how the guidance changes and depending on how the health metrics changed. It's a moving target. It's changed several times between Friday and today.
Yep. Being electronic, Deidre, then is there the ability then to push that out to families via Skyward let's say we have to change it 5 times in the first month. We can push that out, families can acknowledge it, sign it, and then it's done. So we don't have to worry about any other distribution.
Yes, we do all of that. Beth and Tess in our communications department do all of that through a Google form sign in saying, yep, I've acknowledged that I've read this and I've accepted, what's in the Student Rights and Responsibilities Handbook. So we can do all of that electronically throughout the year as needed.
Other questions? All right, then we'll look for a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any additional comments or questions? Not all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, great. Thank you for putting all that together and for the constant evolution of all of these documents and processes and everything else that everyone has to do. So thank you very much. Nothing else on the agenda. We would look for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any additional comments or questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Have a great night, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Stay safe. Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.